going to try to set a tax levy and let operating budgets derive from what the tax levy is? Or are we going to decide what we want our operating budgets to be and figure out what the levy to make that happen is? So I think those are the legitimately two ways to do it. I know I've complained to Brad about this over the years, but we've been able to sort of manipulate all three of these factors because we're in such a unique position. But that's really not a realistic way to do it. We're actually very lucky to have been able to do that. I mean, accommodated accounts are uncontrollable costs. You know, the tax levy is a hard and fast number, and operating budgets as well. So in my viewpoint, tax levy drives down to what operating budget should be, or operating budgets drive up to what tax levy should be. And I think that's something we need to talk about going forward, not for this year. We're gonna continue to control all three variables, or at least pretend we can. The other thing I think I want to talk about going forward, and I think we need to just do a refresher course on accommodated accounts and why we budget those and how it's beneficial for the town overall and all town departments to do it that way. And I feel like sometimes when I talk to individuals, it's somewhere along the line that everybody has a little different idea in their head of how accommodated accounts sort of work and how it benefits one department or the other. And I think it's with a pretty quick discussion, we can sort of get everybody on the same page on sort of the benefits of budgeting for uncontrollable costs that way. So the next tab down is some financial information on recent results. You can see the previous guidelines over the past 3 years. And below that, what we tried to do is match up what the actual impact of those guidelines were on the average single-family tax bill. So you can see somewhat of what different levy increases have resulted in terms of the impact on our residential homeowners. It's interesting information, and you can definitely draw a direct correlation. There's much more into it than this, just these guidelines. There's a whole other values part of the equation. So there's not a direct correlation between a tax levy and how it's going to impact a single-family house. Every year is a little bit different, just based upon what's going on with the values in the community. So there's not a real scientific way to sort of predict it, but this at least shows the correlation as to what sort of happened over the past several years. Next document here, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but we basically took John Petrin's ugly spreadsheet with very valuable information comparing us to other communities, and he improved it with some visual graphs and stuff like that. We're not going to spend too much time going through it. I think it's great information for all of you to have, just to sort of keep everything in perspective. We still have very low taxes in comparison to other communities, and we're in very strong financial condition compared to our neighbors and other communities, and all that information is here for you to utilize at your Christmas dinner when you're arguing with your relatives about the taxes being too high, or et cetera. You'll have all the data that you sort of need to defend the work that we've done on this stuff here. I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time on it, but it's great information and really puts everything into perspective. Following sheet here is the typical format of what you guys have become accustomed to seeing on the scenarios. Each different color represents a different tax levy increase. Probably the biggest change is that John wanted to get it all on one page, so I agree, it's a much better look and presentation on that. But each of these scenarios assumes the same accommodated accounts increase, the same, we're budgeting nothing for state aid and local receipts. So every scenario is the same, with the exception of changing the tax levy and different operating budget increases going across. It sort of shows the impact of sort of where we are today if we were to select any one of these options. And as you guys know from the past, at this point in the process, any option we select is going to put us into a deficit situation, which is what the number is at the bottom. Coming from the finance side of things, I know that there's a number there that, a comfort zone that we feel as though that we have historically been able to cover during the budget process through budget savings in some areas, through being able to evaluate local receipts and collections and determining how much we can offset of the budget with that, as well as, the operating budgets have come in lower than guideline. And at some point, we'll get information from state aid in terms of what we can expect, but it's not significant to us typically, any increases on state aid. So each one of these is a very similar scenario. During our discussion on the guidelines, we started out with a recommendation from the administration of a 4.5% tax levy increase with a 3.25% operating budget increase.
Total
And
expense.
our recommendation was sort of based on the fact that when we set the tax rate, the Board of Selectmen, I think, was not crazy about the increase on the residential homeowners this year. They pretty much, it was a planned tax levy increase, so there were no surprises there. But the board is typically more comfortable setting a tax rate that will result in a lower impact on the residential homeowner, so that we had that one force working here. On the operating budget side, I know I probably didn't do as good a job of talking about needs during that morning discussion. That was one of the things that John chimed in with me on. And some of the pressures, and I know the superintendent is here, he can talk about the school side. Some of the pressures here on the town side, last year, we had a request for a couple positions in the water department that were very, very crucial to the operation. We're considering developing a request for an economic development type position. This is not a new idea to me, but we really feel at this time, and given the competitive environment versus the competition that we're in for companies to come to Burlington, that, we've sort of gotten by on our location for many years, but many other communities are getting much more aggressive in getting into the business of attracting businesses to the town. So we sort of feel like this is a very important position to the future of the town, and we hope that we can get support for that leading up to the upcoming town meeting.
And keeping positions too. So, keeping the businesses we have.
Thank you. You guys know from the budget process last year, the police department requested some additional funds for training, so that's gonna continue to be a pressure for us, public safety in general. You know that we're working really hard to implement the ALS system for the ambulances. Going forward, that's gonna create some stress on the fire department budget, so depending upon the timing of that initiative, some of the impacts of that will most likely be felt in the upcoming budget in the fire department. There'll be some increased revenue to go along with it as well, but that doesn't necessarily work its way into the actual department's budget in the way that we budget. So those are some of the things that they're gonna causing the town side of government a little bit of stress. And again, I know Superintendent Conti's here. I don't know if he wants to come up to the table. So we talked a little bit about that and the possibility of being able to meet 3.25 operating budget. So we had a pretty long discussion about that, and one of the positives that came out is, for the first time in recent years, Nicole was able to give us a budget projection on the special ed account much earlier than we have typically been able to utilize that number. So that number came in a little bit lower than we had been anticipating in our planning. So that gave us a little bit more flexibility than what we had anticipated. And there was one other item, and I'll let Eric address that, but the school transportation contract is up this year. So that is a really potential budget buster for the school department. So we sort of talked a lot about that during our group discussion. So the initial recommendation that we had made as the administration was for a 4.5% levy increase, 3.25% blended operating budget increase. We had a lot of discussion on that, and we were able to, I guess, negotiate amongst ourselves as to whether or not we could do a 4.5% tax levy and a 3.5% operating budget with a blended between the town and the schools. And the only other aspect of it was that we would consider the impacts of the school transportation RFP and the impacts to their budget sort of separately from the guidelines discussion. And that was sort of where, after a lot of discussion, we sort of ended up agreeing that we all might, nobody's happy with the end result, which I think is typically a good compromise. Superintendent Conti's here, he can sort of speak a little bit more about the pressures the school department's facing. I had a chance to do a little bit of the town, so I don't know if he wants to walk through some of that now.
Yeah, just briefly, most of what drives the school committee is obviously salary and enrollment. So school committee recently completed a 10-year renewal of their master plan. We do have some, we're graduating smaller classes and we're seeing larger classes come in. And I think that's relatively intuitive when you see the houses that are being built in town, and there are many families coming in. So I think we're beginning to see some of that enrollment pressure. But as Paul stated, there are oftentimes some unknowns in our budgets as we move forward with employee contracts. That's not the case with the school districts going forward. So we have settled contracts moving forward for next year, which eliminates a lot of the unknown for us. The only contract that is unsettled for us is the transportation contract. So Nicole's done some work looking at increases in transportation contracts in surrounding areas. We had some concerns about the possible increases. I think just for some context, it's about $1.5 million contract for us annually. We provide transportation for every student in the community who needs transportation. Buses. What did I say?
No, I said bless you.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said, I didn't say buses or something, bless you. So,
Gesundheit.
there you go. Blessing buses, so, so that was, our concern. So, I think we did receive a lot of feedback that, we should try to look, carefully at the transportation contract. I think we met with a transportation consultant this morning, and we're going to go out to bid early and try to get that number in as quickly as we can. So, and then again, the direction from the school committee is they want to continue to provide seats for all students as when they to get to school if needed. But we'll look at routes and sort of time, and so that's really our largest financial unknown. We have obviously students in need, so it's just not about enrollment, it's about the type of students that make up that enrollment, whether they need language support services or other types of supports. And again, the guidelines have been tight for us, but I never want this committee or the town or town meeting to sort of conflate that with that we're not supported well. So we are generously funded by the town. We offer a wide range of programs. We provide great services for all of our students, and we just would like to maintain that. So again, I'm saying I think that was the pushback on the guideline, and was not about schools aren't funded well. We're just looking to maintain the programs that we have. Last year's guideline was a challenge for us, obviously, and we reduced some positions. We'd like to slowly and gradually bring some of those positions back. We know we can't do that all at once, but having the transportation contract as a conversation that I think we can have, a separate conversation that we can really look at deeply, I think would really help us make the guideline conversation Paul mentioned the 3.5, the 4.5 on the levy and the 3.5 blended, make that work for us. And as Paul said, no one left happy, and that's usually a good result.
Anything else? Questions, Frank?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I don't want to start the broad questioning. I just want to do a little bit of clarification that I think will help everyone. So your recommendation, I'm taking it, is to focus in on the second page, which is the 4.5% levy.
Blue.
The blue, right? And if you run down that column at the 4.5 and the 3.5% budget,
Yes.
right? That's the column we're in. So running down that, I just want to clarify, when you say that between general government and general education, we're going to have a blended number, in the percentages against both of those, the general government amount is a 51.6 billion, and education is a 53.165, right?
No, the first number is the accommodated account, so we actually have the three categories of budgets there. Accommodated, which is sort of the third category.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, general government's
government
37.
And then education.
Okay, and so general government, you have up at 3.75%, right?
3.5, 37, 122 at 3.5.
Right.
37,122, you see that, Frank?
Yeah, so I don't see how you get how we extract the blended.
This is just
Percent.
this is a planning document.
I
This is not-
understand.
So by
Does this
taking-
reflect the blended number?
No.
Ah,
So.
Okay, that's, I get it then, okay,
So, yeah, treat this as a planning document only.
okay.
On a historical perspective, sort of the blending has sort of worked out that the school department would come in around a quarter a point higher than the stated guideline.
So when we go
General
through the
government-
detailed budgeting, you guys will work out the shift
Yeah, we work together to
that
sort
still
of-
maps to these holistic
So
numbers.
that when we add together, we will add.
I get it.
Get to 3.5.
And you've got kind of a negotiation going on now on what you think the blend would
Well, we
be.
just know what it has been historically.
You'll
so
start
far.
there?
Historically, we've been successful in coming to agreements
Yes,
at this level.
all right,
To bring to both the selectmen and school committee at that level, then to your level for agreement.
all right, because we
So
need,
we've been historically able to come to that agreement, knowing it would be a blended rate. So we've said that pretty much every year, I think. The discussion at our level is, what's that blending? And.
so
we've
it's something
done
like
that.
a .25 shift, something like that. I'm just trying to focus in a little bit so we can think about the data, but I need to make sure I understand it. The other question I have is on, I heard, just listening, so the bus contract, Eric, is something like $1.5 million? So the percentage increase is what's kept outside of, and it could be anywhere from 5 to 10, is that what you're thinking? We just don't know, but
Again,
percent?
yeah, or could be whatever. Again, I honestly, I don't know. It depends on fuel escalators and everything else. So-
Okay, so that potentially $100,000,
Right.
we're gonna have to make that up how in the shift?
No, we can have a separate discussion with Ways and Means about either adding that into this situation or adding it into a warrant article, provided that funding, some mechanism
Okay,
that we will determine as the results of the RFP become a little bit
okay,
clearer.
all right. And the very last thing, just for clarification, if we look at on this same page at the blue column, which is the projection for FY19,
Yep.
you show warrant articles at 9 million?
Yeah,
How did that happen?
well, we did a lot of, $3 million to provide something, the road, in replace of the road bond for free cash. So when you start adding them all up, not the warrant articles that we typically talk about, departmental warrant articles, we added additional funds to OPEB, those all add into the total.
Okay, so
warrant
you pulled in
article.
basically anything that we use
Sewer
free
money
cash
in
for.
there, so,
All right, all right. So why do you think that isn't going to repeat in
It's
FY
not really
'20.
relevant to the projection in that all the warrant articles are funded from something outside of the budget. So there's in reality for 19, there's $9 million of special warrant articles and $9 million of other types of funding to offset that, that's not related to the tax
All
levy.
right.
So for the purposes of the projection, we
Just
just.
ignore it.
3.8 million, and there's a 3.8 million free cash source offsetting that.
balanced out.
So it's not an impact to any of the scenarios you're looking at. What we decide to do with warrant
Okay.
articles will be done with separate sources of funding.
Okay, and the last thing, I'd just like for calibration, the free cash number that we're working with is the 11.6, correct? What were we working with previous year?
12.7 approximately.
Thank you.
Mike, you had a question?
Yes, it's similar to Frank's. I guess it's more an observation. I think at one point in time, I don't know how long ago, but the general government education were roughly 50/50 of the budget, and it's the education budget's been growing at a little bit of a higher rate, so it's getting bigger and bigger than the town budget was. So I think, it's the blending aspect there is, I guess, gonna have to just be, monitored or whatever, because it's, you got the one side growing a little bit bigger than the other side.
That's been the administration's point a couple of times over the last few years, and it is a balance, so we want to make sure you're aware of that, but it is something we've been pointing out, and, that's why, we've been fighting for some positions in the general government side, over the last few years, to address the stress of growth, and most of the positions, as you know, we've had to highlight and show why, when we added the firefighters and the police. I think you got very good reports from us, on background, data as to why these positions are necessary, but it is something that, we do monitor. And, Paul's talked about, some of the things that we need to be looking at, moving forward, and we gotta give some, some strength to. I look at some of the towns around us, and they're adding positions in places, Lexington, Arlington just added public information officers, for the first time into their budget, we're not asking for positions of that nature, we're asking, we've been asking for line positions, because of our growth in, our line areas.
So just one more comment. Along that line, with the majority of the budgets being based on salary and the nature of contracts behind all the salaries, that's the one thing that we can really be careful about, is adding new positions. So I think that's
Yes.
why we've asked for the justifications and the solid explanations, because that's really our one area that we can kind of,
And rightfully so, and I think,
Just.
our departments have done, a very creditable job, in providing the data and, the background, and not just asking for these positions, but showing, what the impact of these positions are. And, so, we've worked with, your subcommittees, over the last few years, and it's not just a blind request. It is based on, data-driven, information.
right?
You all set, Mike?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, just Phil first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Well, Merry Christmas. On the local receipts, we had that new tax increase 2 years ago, I think, or was it 3 years ago now, that you could add on to the meals tax?
That's been 7 years now.
Time flies.
Yeah,
But we added a number of
You
other,
young guys.
Frank's the oldest here now, cut it up.
It's at least, maybe 8 years ago. It's been here, I've been here
It's
7.
20 years, John.
Yeah, 20 plays, right.
I'm pushing up a close second, though.
Is the meals tax in the local receipts?
Yes.
So what
Meals
kind of,
and hotels taxes fall within that category.
and what kind of, well, we've had a number of additional liquor licenses, I think 20 or so. So are we seeing enormous growth in that area?
We've had growth in the meals tax. It's definitely slowed down over the past several years. In 18, we collected 1.8 million. The previous year, we collected 1,729,000. So although there's new restaurants opening relatively frequently, at some point, we sort of feel as though it's not all new meals. So some of the meals are somebody who was gonna go to this restaurant, now they're going to this restaurant. So the tax is not growing in conjunction. I think
Well,
there's a
that's
little
my
bit.
point. We've reached point of
That's a
diminishing
whole
returns.
other discussion, Phil, because, you know, some of it is, some of our restaurants have been put in transition. So when you look at Chili's is not operating right now, they're rebuilding, the same with Macaroni Grill, the old Outback has been in transition, the Bonefish. There's, you know, I can name, you know, 5 or 6 restaurants that were there that have been replaced by newer restaurants, and those restaurants are being, so we're as interested, you know, as you to see what the effect is. I think it's tied to the economy, like motor vehicle excise taxes. You know, we always get concerned when the economy is like this, motor vehicle excise tax goes like this. When the economy slows, it goes like this because people don't buy cars. You know, as soon as, you know, the economy changes, people, the first thing you keep longer is a car, you know, and then it moves up. So we do monitor that, and we've not seen any decrease at all in our meals taxes, but we are in transition. And same with the hotel tax here. Remember, one of our hotels, you know, got shut down for about almost a year because of the fire, you know, that occurred. So we lost a huge block of rooms with one of the hotels. And so we saw that effect because the rooms just aren't there. But we've opened 2 hotels since then. So what that will do, I think, will increase the hotel tax because the hotel rooms are still filling under this economy. So that's another one. If the economy goes, the first thing businesses will cut back on is travel, which may affect our hotels, you know, because that's tied to that. But we are monitoring that, and we've not seen any slack at all in this.
Well, that's my point, though. We're likely to reach a point of diminishing returns where you're chasing more revenue with more places and you're gonna end up with less revenue.
Say that when a new restaurant opens, that we're not getting all new meals tax. on
Right.
that. Some of it is coming
Some
from
of
what
it
we
is
would have gotten. in a different
Cannibalization.
restaurant the previous year. That's very fair to say.
Now, you mentioned an economic development officer. We're not gonna pursue more tax incentive financing agreements, are you, in order to, for instance, the deal where we stole a building from Bedford, put it into Burlington? What
Worked out
economic
very well for
development?
us. So, you know, you know, that's, you know, it was a very good steal. So, but.
Not if they
the
pay
idea-
less taxes than the rest of them who've been here for 30 or
No,
40
they're paying
years.
very, what that one was, if you look at the deal on that one, it was a 15% deal, which was paid back through the Mass Works grant, you know, right off the bat, you know, and the other thing. So in essence, what we did was we gave them a small tax, it was 15%, that's it, you know, on that, which is light in that area. And what we got in return was public works improvements to that area, which made a, you know, terrific impact. So I think, you know, we do look at that. Now, we've only done 4 TIFs in this community in over the years. 2 of them were, you know, negligible, and, you know, Keurig was probably the biggest one recently, back in 2012. And that had a big impact because it opened up a lot. So these things are not just let's bring a business in. Now, you know, in the last 7 years, we've only done 2 TIFs, Keurig and Millipore. And again, Millipore was about bringing in a new type of business. So it's not about just give a TIF to every single business. Some communities do that because they're desperate to bring people in. But that was about bringing in a life science company because that was going to help this community solidify a new area to flex, you know, to flex that business capacity coming in. And we feel that's working tremendously. And again, that TIF was not a big TIF, you know, when you look at it.
Well, my point is, I mean, we're the second or third largest tax levy in the region. We've never had an economic development officer before. We never had to. But be that as it may. And the last question I have is about redundancies in the school department and in the town department. We're essentially running 2 businesses. So is there opportunity for savings by consolidating accounting functions, budget functions, et cetera, that might be redundant in both departments, on the town side and on the school side?
We've done that a little bit in IT and in HR. HR has been very effective, so we share an HR director, and that's been in place for many years now. And that's been very effective. 6 years ago, we worked with, and I always thank Eric for his cooperation in the IT, because we were failing, you know, on our side, and by consolidating the management, you know, pieces and getting that, our side has been very effective in that area. The accounting and treasury functions, they don't do treasury functions. That's done through, you know, general government straight out, so they don't cut checks on their side. So that is already done. And accounting is, our accounting department basically double checks, the accounting processing of this. So we're not duplicating in that sense. They're doing the processing of the work orders, that come through. They're processing the bills that are received, and then those are batched and sent to, the accounting department for a second overall view. So I'm not sure there's necessarily overlap in that area. It's checks and balances, and I think you're the first who talked to me about check and balances. So, I love tossing that back at you.
I know.
So, you see that big smile. So, so that's a check and balance in there. So I'm not sure, there's an overlap. There's potential areas we could maybe, look at, but it's just generally, not the way it's done, in Massachusetts. And general law says they have total control over their expenditures. But overall, I think we have looked at the couple of areas in which we can share these services. And again, IT, HR are two perfect areas, and we're doing that.
One more, Mr. Chairman, if I could. On the debt service, we are the lowest, or the second lowest in 14, 15 surrounding communities, and the overall outstanding debt is substantially lower than everybody else, with the exception of two, I think. So, and this $9 million, well, obviously, we have more coming on board that's going into long-term debt, right? How much more is coming on?
Fire station, a DPW facility, a MWRA project.
Elementary school, high school renovation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There is no shortage of capital projects.
Thank you, sir.
Sanitation,
Thank you.
sanitation as well. So we got a chock full of capital projects in process and contemplated in the near future.
All right, Diane?
I just wanted to address the blending percentages. This year, when we started looking at the school budget, we took a different approach. We actually met and had discussion with Nicole to say that we wanted actual numbers. It's a different population in the school, with first languages. Dr. Conti, how many different languages are you having to educate the kids now? So we were looking at it as more of continuing services, not expanding any major programs, but we still have saved a lot of money by keeping kids in district and not having to send them out. Do you know off the top of your head how many different languages that you're educating at this point?
I think, again, we have to do a language survey, a home language survey every year, so I think there's 50 languages that's spoken at the high school. Obviously, not every student who speaks a second language requires academic support. Many do, but one of the things we have to look at is what is the language spoken in the home, and then we have to screen all of those students and then determine the level of service that they require.
So my point is that at least for the past 5 or 6 years, I've noticed a huge change in the school budget and with the requirements that we're having to do. So, I absolutely agree with the blended, but I just don't want to get hung up over, well, this department has 3% more, or, whatever it is. The whole point is that we want to make sure that the kids have what they need, what we're required to by law, and it's a different population now, so.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted a little clarification on the free cash. If I read this properly, it looks like you're planning on taking 2.75 out of free cash, and there's a deficit of 1.4. So if we wanted to keep free cash to be roughly the same at the end of the year, is the assumption that, roughly $4.25 million is going to show up through some sort of revenue or expense reduction to keep the free cash roughly the same? Is that the right way to read this, or?
Free cash is not really something that we have a lot of control over. We can sort of push it in the right direction through conservative budgeting, but it's very dependent upon the local economy is what drives our free cash. I think in a year or two before I got here, free cash was $700,000. We had many low years in the 2-3 millions, which we were able to work with. But if you were to talk about our free cash now, it's primarily generated by just us having a very good local economy on the receipt side of things. And as always, every year, every department turns back a few dollars, that ends up back into free cash that's unspent budget funds, so it's not really, it would be like predicting what your net income next year is gonna be on a private company, so it's a result of operations, so if everybody spends every dollar in their budget that they need to, and if the revenue comes in lower, we may not generate any new free cash this year, so what we didn't spend the previous year would be sort of what we had.
So,
Free
let-
cash here. So what this is being highlighted for is the capital, is the warrant articles. So we set aside, 2.5 million approximately, for warrant articles. So this will offset that. That comes from free cash.
okay,
Now,
but,
to get that negative at the bottom, I think getting to, part of your question is, what you see here is that the local receipts has no increase, and the state, receipts have no increase. So we will be seeing increases in that. How that plays out is the numbers we'll be working with over the next few months. I'm not sure you're gonna see much decrease in the expenditures that are programmed here. That's why we set the guidelines, because we'll be asking for, the full amount of the expenditures, in that area. So the guideline is 3.5, being requested, and the accommodated accounts. We already know we're gonna hit those numbers, so our goal is to stay within those numbers, and then adjust those revenues, so that we have a balanced budget.
okay, so the assumption is that based on historical experience, at least the 1.4 will somehow come out in
That's
revenue
right.
somewhere
And that's
along the
normal.
way.
The 1.4, as Paul said earlier, that's kind of where we start the negative.
Yep.
So we always come into this discussion with a deficit. This is the range of that deficit we're normally in every year. And then once we adjust the actual revenue. So we're not making certain assumptions in here yet on the revenues. That we do as we move forward.
Great, thanks.
Brad?
This is so I don't get yelled at BCAT, so. One of the things we talk about at the, every BCAT board meeting is why do people at public meetings use their microphones? So let me make sure it's on. There we go. Thank you. So a few questions. What are the contracts looking like for next year? What are the increases?
I think the teachers are at, the cost of living is what, 1.5, and then most of our other ones are probably right around between 2.
Okay.
So we're right in
Okay.
that.
So
say average of
contract,
2% basically.
so contracts don't eat up the whole increase in the budget. so-
Well, again, Mr. Bond, it's cost of living increase is one part of it, but
Yes.
we also have many employees that get additional money for another year of service or additional education. So even if we don't have a COLA, we probably have about again, roughly around a 3% increase just to meet the needs of our, sort of the structure of the contracts.
Okay.
And then COLA is typically on top of that.
Okay. And on the general government side?
We have some unsettled.
They're all unsettled as of June 30th.
Oh, all right.
So all our contracts expire come June 30th, and so we'll be negotiating new contracts for, I think, pretty much everybody.
Okay, thank you. And the question on
They'll be negotiating.
again, I'm still concerned. I mean, our debt service is up from about 2% up to 4%. Any plans, do you think just what's on the table is going to push us up to 6%? And if so, how do we accommodate that? Or are
We're
we
trying
still
hard to increase our debt service, so,
And just so people at home don't think we're just being perverse, we need to, you don't want our buildings and infrastructure to crumble, so we need to.
we need to
pour enough money back.
continually reinvest in our infrastructure, including the stuff you can't see, stuff below the ground.
And we've been dinged in the past for, by the bond rating agencies, or they're still cool with the 4% with their levels?
Yeah, I mean, we've been, that's the only danger. It's not a bad thing to have low debt, but what you have to weigh it against is how many projects that we need to get done going forward.
Yep.
So, as you know, you've been involved with it a long time. We've really put a lot of emphasis on the borrowing program. It just, the things take a little bit longer than we anticipate. Public Works should have started 3 years ago. The fire station should have started 4 years ago, but the process sort of drags it out. I know Eric's been waiting for the MSBA to come in to help us out with the high school. It got delayed another year, so through no fault of our own, we're trying to borrow more money to get some of these things done, but the nature of the process typically doesn't allow us to do that as quickly as we may anticipate. So.
And this is kind of a related note. I guess I'm a little concerned about the levy cap, the delta being over $11 million. Back in the old days, I mean, I think it bottomed out back when I was chair ages ago at about $1.5 million. So it's increased, which is good, where our spending is under control. But my concern is the town has, and I've been on this the past 3 or 4 years, the town is seeing a growth in its tax base. And, when we were presented with the Northwest Park proposal, we were told that we need, this many more firemen, this many more policemen, this much more DPW support. I'm just concerned that even though we've grown the tax base, are we collecting enough taxes to support that growth? And that this number is of concern, but what are the thoughts? Or have we added enough to do that support?
Well, the excess levy capacity is also a function of a strong local economy too. So, the amount of building and development projects that have gone on is what has driven that. Can't really access any tax dollars just based upon the commercial new growth, because every tax dollar has to get split between the residents and the commercials. So just because, let's just say we had no residential growth and only commercial growth, we can't just collect more money in taxes from the businesses. It gets spread out based upon the formula. So every dollar of taxes will affect residents and businesses in the same share as any other dollar. So we can't just sort of access the commercial taxes for a new commercial building directly.
So there's going to be an inherent lag then in capturing that. All right. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, one more. So over the years, I've you're talking about pulling the bus contract out of the discussion on the operating budget. I have been a proponent of pulling out, increase in staffing in fire and police and such to support the increased infrastructure, kind of pulling those kind of one-time jumps, as it were, out of the operating budget. Do you see, is there anything other than the bus contract that you see is just kind of increases to support the growth in town beyond that? But
Well, I just want to make sure I'm precise, and I think someone said it correctly, and I am corrected about being precise. The transportation contract is going to stay in our operating budget. I'm talking about the increase to the transportation contract is what we're talking about. So that's the unknown for us. We know we're going to be in for what the contract is. So we're not pulling it completely out. So I just
no,
wanna
I
make sure
understand,
that
and I'm talking.
Paul corrected me several times, and I just want to make sure that I get it.
And again,
the increase of the
what I had been arguing for again is, increases, I was making the case that for our increase in staffing in the fire department, we should have pulled that delta, which was a big delta, out of the regular operating budget. I was making that case, but.
Eventually, it's got to go back.
Yeah, that's,
Oh, no, out of the no, you still capture it on the tax levy, of course, but we try to keep our increases to the operating budget as tight as possible, but there are, a few spikes that we have here and there that overall will drive up that number, but just because of the reality of, when population goes up, you need more police, and if that drives their budget up.
Well, I think we've made
And
sort of,
we've accommodated that, but.
right, short-term, some particular year's budget may have more personnel increases than strictly at the guideline because of that.
Right.
But the next year, we're back to, the same old percentage.
Oh, yeah, it's all captured, but, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, could I follow up with Mr. Bond for a moment?
Brad, are you finished? You have more?
That's good for now, thank you.
All right, yes,
You mentioned the rating agencies had dinged us on debt service?
Years
I
ago.
presume that was because it was going up?
No, because
No,
it was too
it
low.
was
because
too
it was
low.
low,
We
okay.
were looking,
Underinvesting.
Okay.
eight or 9 years ago, we were about a 2% level, and they.
Well,
they-
Lexington's still at 10, is at 10%, we're at 4%, Lexington is still AAA at 10%. Are they still AAA?
A typical AAA nationwide is about approximately 8%, 8 to 10 for debt service, so.
Thank you.
A better way, a better, I think a better way to say it is we're under-investing according to the averages. And that turns into a future problem if you don't pay attention to it.
Our credit card debt is too low.
Right, all right. More questions, anyone? Right.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I just want to follow up a bit more. I don't want to keep us here all night, but on the whole free cash discussion that we were getting into a little bit, I'd like to just clarify and maybe amplify slightly to make sure I've got it right. So the plan here is to, from free cash, basically roll in 2.75 million. Put that against warrant articles, and that's the traditional thing we do.
Yes.
Right? The balance of the free cash, which this year is 11 million, we're just gonna do a set aside on that and then visit what are the best and most necessary uses of it, if any. And but that never enters into the operating budget, financing, or contraction, or expansion. Right, and we sort of smartened up maybe a decade ago to never go there because it's irrecoverable. If the free cash doesn't come in, you're toast in the following year. All right, so we will get to the discussion about what to do with the balance of the 8 million in free cash that's there, and we'll separately tackle that. But one of the things that I think ties into this whole tax increase discussion is growth of the community and investment in the community. So we have to remember that the commercial base, in part, is here because this is the right place. In fact, it's completely because it's the right place for them to be. They're not here because they love us. They're here because they can do well here. It's a good place to be. A piece of that is that we need to invest in general for them as well, for residents and students, and you got to invest for everybody. And so my view of the free cash that we've got is we should try to deploy that as best we can to supplement where we need to invest, to accelerate investments where we're slow, to try to stay ahead of that without raising taxes any more than we already are. So we buy down debt. We'll take bans and retire them. We'll not even bond something. We'll just buy it out of free cash. And that keeps opening up that window of the debt schedule, which honestly should be up in the 7% area, because we do have a backlog of infrastructure that will eventually be painful. So that's sort of my lecture on. And you're drilling down on this tax plan. You're sort of leading us down. This is the path where we think we can go and still take care of infrastructure. And the $1.4 million deficit that you're showing here now, you think you're going to be able to balance out traditionally, not with free cash, but with sort of hopeful local receipts / state aid, whatever, and hit that balance. And if we really come, April, we know we're not going to be able to close it, then we'll have to do something else. But the last thing we'd do is go to free cash. In fact, I would say we should never go
Never.
there.
Even then, we won't, no.
And just to echo
So-
Frank's point, I think over the past several years, we've paid for approximately $12 million of projects that were on the debt schedule, scheduled to be borrowed with free cash. And if you think of it in terms of that, that's a fire station plus the senior center renovation that went on that we didn't borrow the money for, we paid cash for it. And just to sort of get into the percentages, we borrow really for expensive things. Many communities borrow for computers, police cruisers. We never even think about borrowing for that stuff. So a lot of the stuff that we build in to pay with cash, it would end up in another community's debt line. So
Right.
our percentages maybe would be considered a little bit higher if you consider what we would have borrowed but we paid cash for. I think probably closes that delta from the 4% closer to where we want to be in terms of investing in our infrastructure. because we are very, like I say, we bond for larger scale projects. In many communities, they bond $50,000 items, again, computers, vehicles, things like that, that we always choose to pay cash for because the useful life tends to be much shorter. We don't want to have loans out on that type of equipment, so.
All right, Brad?
If it's just, if it's, you know, less than an hour's work, I'd be curious to, if you guys could estimate what you think the you know, effective debt service rate is, you know, given that we're paying this stuff in cash.
Well, I mean, off the bat, I'd say if you could add the 2.7 million that we spend on warrant articles, almost all of those items would be eligible to be borrowed for. So if you added that onto our debt service, it has an impact there. And that doesn't even include when we take 3 million from free cash and do the road work and things like that. So I think our investment level is there. We just may get there a little bit of a different way. Some of, you know, we're paying more cash, paying for free cash with a lot of things that a lot of towns are borrowing for.
And that number probably varies so much year to year that it wouldn't be worth the
A little bit,
exercise
but I
to
mean,
go
even
back
if you
through
just
and.
take the 2.7 million is relatively consistent in terms of warrant articles between the town and the school. And most of those are capital in nature and would be eligible to be borrowed. We just pay for them, so.
Bottom line in the whole discussion is the single-family tax, you know, the average single-family tax bill. That's really the bottom line in what gets done. That's what the selectmen look at, you know, in particular, and we do this every year. And when you look at, you know, the community, you know, the comps, Burlington over the last, you know, 5 years has done the best out of the 13 comps here at maintaining the lowest increase on the single-family tax bill. And just as a note, in the last 4 years, I got a couple numbers here. So on the commercial, on the levy share, the commercial is paying 62.1% of the taxes in this community right now. 4 years ago was 60.6. That's over 1.5% shift, you know, to the commercial tax base in a 4-year period. You know, and that's basically a shift that has kept that single-family, average single-family tax bill down. Because when you look at, you know, Paul's numbers on this sheet here, you know, when you look at these numbers, it says, we've increased the tax levy 4.87, 3.94, 1.49, 3.49. The average single-family percent increase was only 3.85, 278, 181 against those two numbers. So what happened? The average commercial tax bill went up higher than that, you know, that levy in order to offset that. So you got to be careful, you know, with that. And that tax levy, Brad, you mentioned it. We were 1.5 million 7 years ago on the tax levy available. You know, we're now 11 million. We could collect that, but that all would have went against that, you know, single-family average tax bill. And that's the dilemma we have, you know, when we talk to you folks, when we talk to, you know, or you talk to townspeople, we talk to town meeting members, selectmen, and that's the biggest discussion we have with selectmen, is that one number. What's the average single-family tax bill go up? And so that's the real discussion here, because there's a lot of room for growth here to get better in our debt service, you know, but it means affecting that number. So we've been taking a slower approach without affecting that number. It's not as fast as what I would have liked to have seen, you know, when looking at, you know, getting to some of these projects. But it is fitting what you all are taking a look at, along with, you know, the residents and everybody else. Because the selectmen, and I'm sure you hear, you know, why are taxes going up so much? You know, I look at it, and I live in another community, I say, oh my God, you're complaining about that? You want to see my tax bill? You know, and, you know, so that's, you know, that's the discussion we have here. So that's the balancing act. So when we have these discussions, you know, it's a different discussion at the selectmen's table. It's a different discussion here, and appreciate the fact that you're all pointing out the various pieces, but I'm still gonna say it boils down to that one number, what's the average single-family tax bill increase? You know, because I think you've all admitted, we do a pretty good job in our government here. You know, you can't go through this budget. I think one Ways and Means member who got off recently said, there's no work to be done because we've checked it all and it looks good. So you do a great job every year, you know, in you know, breaking down our budgets. We spend a lot of time with you folks, you know, in the subcommittee meetings and then, you know, at these levels, breaking down the 10 cents, type stuff. And, Mike, you love your forms, and we got them for you. You look at them, and, we look at this stuff, so it's there. So that's what it really boils down to, in the end, is making everybody, reasonably happy to, with that number.
And despite all of that, and I think Eric already mentioned this, the committee and town meeting has been very fair with all departments in terms of providing our funding. Despite all these constraints, I think that all departments have funded very, very generously.
Okay. Phil?
Just one more
You want to make a motion?
No, but I just want to make the point that your figures over the 10 years is average 2.62% of the tax bill.
Yeah.
Residential tax bill.
And that's not bad when you look at the other communities.
Oh, I got it.
And we're the lowest, in those numbers, when you look at the other communities. I think, I forget the numbers, but we've jumped from the 130th highest community 5 years ago to like the 160th, community. That's a pretty good, that's going the right way, first of all, just to let the home audience know, that's going the right way. Being number one is bad in this situation, which I think is the town of Weston. So they're the highest, tax community. We were at 130, we're down to 160, give or take, in that number. And over the last 5 years, and we're probably one of the few communities that can show, that drop in number like that.
I will move the blue line, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'll second it for discussion, but I'd like to ask one more question if we get a chance.
All right, got to move in second, and Brad, you got a question?
Just a follow-up to us patting ourselves on the back here. Yeah, for the past 10 years, on average, we're looking at about a $100 increase in taxes through some really tough times 10 years or so ago, and yet we, for good and bad, there was no reduction in services. I mean, we really didn't have to step back and do some huge, massive reorg just to hold on, So I think we got lucky on some years, the way the numbers played out, but yeah, very good. Thank you.
John, for,
Just a quick clarification on the motion. We're not moving to blue line, which was last year's budget.
Correct.
We're moving to 4.5%
We're
with
moving the blue
3.5% budget.
recommendation, Rick.
yes.
The fourth column.
Moving the recommendation of the financial team.
Yeah, it's this middle column.
clarification.
You all set? Okay. Yeah, I was going to restate it before I ask anybody to vote on it.
Thank you.
4.5 and 3.5.
Right.
So if there's nothing else, we have a
So
motion.
I would
Yeah.
like to I want to just make sure we're, hopefully we get people that are listening, and certainly there are some people in the audience tonight. So, we always get this, why do we keep raising our taxes, right? That's exactly what the selectmen are telling you. And the commercial sector doesn't usually stand up and pound the table, but they sure notice, right? I mean, they take it all in. And it's the residents will say, why? So let's just think for a second, to reiterate this. We've settled, in all the contract settlements that we've done, it seems to me that we have stayed as a community with reasonable increases. We've not gone over the top. We've tried to not undercut our employees because we want stability. And I think we generally pay well, but certainly, not exorbitant. 80% of this is driven by settled contracts, roughly, and benefits, right? We're not about to take away benefits. I think that would be insane. So what you're left with is a necessary increase that provides for a little bit of growth, probably, in the support of the infrastructure, right? We add police and fire occasionally. We add teachers as we need to. We add librarians as we need to. We added IT people. And we do that for the past 5 years. We've done a certain amount of that. We did it for the health. What the heck is it? Pardon?
Leahy Health?
No. But anyway, so when needed, we add them, and we've been able to do that. And that's what's driving these increases. And I would support this level of increase, which will result in probably to the taxpayer a $1 increase very similar to what they had this past year. I think it'll be very much in line with what, you said $195 was the average single-family increase. This will probably result in something very much like that would be my anticipation. And I think it's completely reasonable, although, you know, nobody wants to pay more taxes, and I know that, this committee knows that, but there's no other way to keep all of these plans that we've got in place going from an operating point of view without cratering something else. And the last thing in the world we want to do is let up on investments and the use of free cash for debt service and other things. You've got to get it out of operating monies. And so that's the kind of increase that makes the most sense to me. And I think we can balance out the $1.5 million hole. That's why I would vote for this. 'Cause I think to do anything less sets the stage to create more problems on the operating side. You know, we're already seeing some concerns with education. The same thing could happen in general government if you don't fill spots that need the right support to maintain the growing infrastructure. And if we don't grow, if we don't invest, then I can assure you, 5 years out, it'll turn up in the commercial sector at the very least. So I would vote for this, and that's why I will tonight.
All right, thanks. Anything else? There's a motion on the floor to support a guideline, or a tax levy of 4.5% and a guideline of 3.5%. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0.
Mr. Chairman, just a reminder on the bus, the change in the bus contract, not the entire bus contract. That will be subject to further discussion as related, outside of the guideline.
Yep, understood. All right, thank you for that. Great presentation. And
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
I just want to thank the committee for their support over the years. I got a couple more meetings, but Paul will probably be leading more of the discussion.
You're throwing a big party, right, John?
Yeah, it's sure thing.
That's what the free cash is
I'll let you
for.
know where and when. The one suggestion, one true suggestion I would make is taking a look at your 3 town meetings. You only need 2. You know, the 3 town meetings is a huge waste of time on staff time. And it puts, I'm telling you that, the stress and the strain we put on that extra 3rd meeting is not necessary.
Why don't we get rid of May?
What's that?
Get rid of May.
Yeah.
Just give them
My
the mic.
suggestion to you would be early March and October, and I think Paul would probably, concur with that. But a strong suggestion, just take a look at the 3 town meetings. I think, that 3rd one, we spend a lot of time out of my office, with town meeting time, and it's unnecessary, doing the September, the January, and the May. You could get everything done still within an October and a March, and it saves you money.
But to do March means we're gonna have to be doing budgets over
No,
Christmas.
April, well, no, early April, but you can keep the May if you wanted to. I think we'd prefer early April, but, you keep the May, but at least get the October, get rid of the January and, the September, and do one in between. And it covers the 2, the time and energy. We spend a lot of time getting, in my office, just preparing the town meetings, and it's just not necessary. We're the only town that does 3, as a note. Out of 351, we are the only town that does 3. So,
Well, that's something for the bylaw review committee to look at. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'll see you again a few more times.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so one of the other items on the schedule was to get an update on the school financial investigation. I know they've been working on it for a while. Who wants to speak to this? John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as you mentioned, there has been a lot of work on this. The school subcommittee is basically in a state of constant investigation, I would say. As Diane just reminded me, the latest investigation has been going on probably like 10 years. Most recently, we've had a lot of work with the revolving accounts going on, and that's still ongoing. But back in September, it was the $700K deficit obviously highlighted a growing interest in a more specific investigation. And so that's what we've been focusing on since September. And since then, we've had 7 subcommittee meetings. We've been to 5 school committee meetings. We've apprised the Board of Selectmen of the investigation. And we're calling this an investigation. Specifically, it's not an audit in particular, so we're not in general going down and validating every number. We're making sure that they make sense and that things add up, but we're not going off and validating payroll and things like that. We're leaving that to the standard town auditors to cover. And this was an investigation that is required because of the 100-plus citizen petitioners that requested an investigation. So by bylaw, we had to do that and had to get the investigation approved by the Board of Selectmen. So as part of the process, we've developed a list of currently 20 questions. We're adding a few. It's grown over time to guide the conversation with the school administration. And they've been very cooperative on this. We've had a lot of meetings with them. And in general, the categories are, one, obviously getting at the details of the deficit, going through how the administration validates various expenses with, substitutions and or substitutes and position changes and so forth. And also going through how various portions of the FY19 budget were developed, just to sort of sanity check that we're not heading down a path for the same thing to happen again. So we've met with Nicole Kasha, in particular, business manager, several times. She's provided a lot of the answers to the questions. We have a few more outstanding and a few more we've developed, but we're getting very close at this point. In addition, during the same time frame, actually back in September, we submitted a set of policy and procedure recommendations for the school administration and school committee to consider. Those cover things about documenting. It documents what spending and transfer authorities would be, make that a little more formalized, what approvals would be required, ensuring that there's only spending within an authorized purchase order, cash handling procedures, revolving accounts, financial reporting, and some of this has been incorporated into policies already, and we'll be meeting a little bit more to go over some of the procedural updates to ensure that stuff gets worked in also, those recommendations get worked in also. So one of the big things that has been highlighted in the past has been an issue with sort of the lack of visibility into potential problems and deficits coming up, and why was this not recognized until the end of the fiscal year. And obviously one of the big things to increase visibility is a little more reporting. So it's something that hasn't happened previously in FY18, but is happening now. Since October, we've had 3 updates from the business office at the school committee meetings where the budget, the actual spending, and most importantly, the forecasted spending to the end of the year are described each month. And this is something that will continue each month. So obviously we can see if there's a forecasted deficit somewhere or if the forecasted surplus is shrinking. We can discuss those things, find out what's going on. And it's obviously just important for the school committee to have that information as for us, so that I think in the past, even though obviously there was a problem coming, no one knew it because the forecasting wasn't accurate and wasn't really there, quite frankly. So I think we're seeing right now, we're definitely seeing the forecast is that there is a tiny bit of margin in the budget still. So that's good that we're not forecasting a deficit at this point. And I think kudos to the administration and committee. I think we're seeing appropriate concern and attention to the budget. And there's already been sort of a light freeze put on some of the spending to ensure that the current surplus grows instead of shrinks. So I think those are all good changes. We've seen some good stuff with transparency. So in particular, the school committee policies are all on the school website, and all the contracts, but one which is getting on there, are also on the school website. So any town meeting member that wants to drill down and understand why a teacher gets paid whatever they get paid, they can look at all those contracts and know all the detail. And I think having that kind of transparency is very good. And just as an aside, I did a quick look on some of the other department websites, and I didn't see contracts posted anywhere else. So I would actually recommend that's something that subcommittees might want to talk about with their departments as a thing to consider. I think that level of transparency is a good thing. And then, so finally, while we're still finishing up some of the questions for a specific investigation, we have most of the day at this point, and we're writing the report right now, and we fully expect to have that ready well before the January 28th town meeting for folks to review on the committee in particular, and make sure that we have, and also with the school department, so that our goal is that people will, in general, buy into this report, that the recommendations are things that make sense, that what we're reporting are things that people agree are, in fact, accurate representation, so that it shouldn't be a surprise at town meeting. It should be something that, in general, everyone has looked at and said, yeah, that makes sense.
Great, thanks.
Chairman,
Question, Phil?
if I could suggest that, or let me ask you this, do you propose a preliminary investigative report subject to public comment and committee comment, and then a final report incorporating those items?
I would look at it, roughly, yes. I would look at it slightly differently. I think what we'd like to do is get a preliminary report out, and if there are things that people would like to suggest as edits to improve the report, we would like to actually just incorporate that into an improved report. But yes, we would like to get feedback before presenting it
What
to town meeting.
format would you receive public comment, though?
Well, that's a good question, and one of the things that we were asking in the subcommittee is not entirely clear what is traditionally done with subcommittee reports, if that's something that Ways and Means generally likes to approve, discuss, or, what level of, what is.
It's unusual to this extent that we haven't had a 100-person request for an investigation in, I don't know, 25 years or whatever. Never,
Since the
so.
charter was written.
We don't have a lot of precedent to work on with this.
Since 100 people signed up, I think we ought to have
Actually,
a
it's
short
400, it's
period.
400.
400.
404 certified signatures.
So there's a few of them are interested, apparently.
Yeah. And we saw that at town meeting in September.
Yeah,
This is a similar thing. Diane?
In response to that, our report and investigation has just been really a fact-finding. We're not really looking to prove any points or anything. We've had open meetings, every meeting has been published. We've had a number of town meeting members, and we've been getting feedback right straight along. So this isn't something that we're just gonna come out with a report. We absolutely are planning on sharing it, but ours is just really more of a fact-finding. It's not, we're not trying to validate or justify anything. We're just presenting basically what we've come up with.
So, do you have any suggestions for public comment other than we have a meeting and we solicit
Well,
explicitly?
I think we ought to have
That's-
we ought to have a preliminary report with public feedback, and then a final report after that is either included, if, there's some relevant commentary, or just, go on to the final report. But I do think we have to have a public comment period before the full committee.
Right, so can I suggest taking up the preliminary report idea, and the timing, we'll have to have a meeting in January in advance of the warrant articles that we'll have to vote on for the January town meeting, which is probably a couple of weeks before the town meeting. If the subcommittee had a preliminary report, by then, that could be, we could, it would be good if the full committee, I think, accepted the report, just to give closure on that, and then we can accept comments, and if there are anything to revise it, there's time to do it before.
I guess it's good to get that feedback. I would suggest, and we certainly can do that. The thing I would suggest that would be most productive is if there are community members that are interested in this, and a few of them are in our audience, come to our meetings. So, to report is really the wrong time to get involved with this because, quite frankly, all the work's been done and we're not going to go back and spend another 3 months asking 20 more questions based on feedback at that point. If you've got questions and things you're concerned about, come to the meetings. As I say, we've already had 7 or 8 meetings, so there's no shortage of things to attend. But certainly, we do fully expect to have the report ready for then at that time.
But I think the thing that allows concrete comments is a concrete report.
Yep.
So,
And again, we're looking at it just from a financial standpoint. We're not really looking at it for feedback. I don't feel that way at this point. We have defined the scope. We went to the selectmen's meeting. We've had regular meetings with this, with the subcommittee. We've met, with the school department. We're actually winding down, I guess, at this point. We've already done our research, defined the scope, and we don't really want to continue this after January, other than our regular investigations that we do. We want to put this report to the end.
right, and I think to conclude it, you need to put out a report and
Right.
accept some comment on it.
Of course.
From a timing point of view, I think we can make that work. Again, it's somewhat dependent on receiving all the data from the school department, but presuming that moves along, we should be able to do that, I would think.
Right. So, presenting it at town meeting, it probably doesn't need to be in its final form. A slight slip in the schedule was the preliminary report comes out in time for the town meeting presentation, and you accept comments for a couple of weeks after that, and we finalize it at some ways and means later. Sooner is better. I'm not trying to delay things, but it will get the greatest exposure when we report it out and say we're done.
Sure, and I'll admit, and this is just my personal preference, being the guy who's typing a lot, is to have a final report at town meeting, because we would like to make that presentation at town meeting. We got a pretty strong signal at the last town meeting that people were interested in hearing something. So we wanted to do what we felt was the end of this particular investigation. At that point, it felt like a nice break point, but I understand your point, though. It's certainly worth getting some feedback.
Right. And I agree with the fact-finding focus of the investigation. I think that's the right term. Anybody else have comments about the form or delivery of this?
Diane?
Well, I just wanted to say, just because the report is done doesn't mean we're going to stop reviewing and investigating. This is just one area that we have to put a report together for. So, our work continues every month, and we've been getting the updates every month from Nicole, and it's being addressed every month at the school committee meeting. So this is just, we're trying to finish up this one scope of investigation.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. Sorry, Steve?
Just a shout out to all the hard work that the school subcommittee
Yeah, I
has
would
done.
agree.
We definitely do appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an awful lot of work.
Right, very much appreciated. Doug?
He stole my thunder.
Okay.
The next time.
A couple other small things. You may remember, so the other item I put on the agenda is, so remember when we did the budget last year, we put a couple of grand in the Ways and Means budget for the new bylaw review committee recording secretary. And offline, we've been bouncing around about how that money gets authorized. And the proposal is that the chair of the bylaw review subcommittee will, give us a number. I don't know that Ways and Means actually has to vote on it. It needs a signature or some agreement between Sherry Ellis and me and probably Paul, and I don't think it needs to be more formal than that. But if you want more information, you know, we can come up with the rate and the hours and number of meetings, and some meeting in
How do
January.
we pay our recording secretary?
I believe they just make out time cards and somebody's authorized to sign them. I think that's just agreement with the accounting office as to who's authorized, so.
It was the chair, because I remember Joellen going to Sonia for it last year.
It can be, but it'd be, you know, if the chair of the bylaw subcommittee authorizes it, then that can go straight to Paul, it doesn't have to come through me. And then, yes,
Yeah, I think the first thing we should just establish, and I'm not sure that it'll be difficult, is how much money is it? On an annual basis, what are we expecting this budget to be? And so that was sort of the thing that I think we were having some trouble with is, you know, how much money and exactly what's it for?
right. And well, I
So
think
we
we'll
get
find
some
out.
clarification on that.
Yeah.
And once we've, you know, once you've got a year, you know, of that in flight, it's simply a budget item that typically would get renewed, give or take the run rate of the expenses.
Well, I think in January, we'll find out those numbers, and won't
Can't
put,
imagine they'd be meeting more than we do.
no, I don't think so. Anyway, okay. And then I have a more general question, which I realized is there anything, I mean, so how should that money end up in the Ways and Means budget next year? Should it go somewhere else? And this is a small thing of, broader question I had of, is there any, does anybody remember any of the other things we said last year during the budget season that said, oh, we ought to do this different next year?
I think we didn't know what to do with it.
Well, they should get a line item.
Yeah. That's different than
But-
capital budget
But
or.
where? They want their own department line?
Yeah.
Where's capital?
For a
The
couple
moderator
grand?
has a budget.
It's a subcommittee of the town meeting, isn't it?
All right. I don't
Just make it another subcommittee of town meeting, and it'll get a sheet of paper, and some subcommittee will review the budget, and it gets funded every year.
My only other recollection is that we had a lot of small budgets, and I couldn't remember whether there was any sentiment to try to combine them somehow.
That's a different discussion.
Okay,
Actually,
so,
no, Mr. Chairman, since you brought that up, I'll just throw this out 2 seconds. One thought I've got is some of these small items, we require the subcommittees to meet on every single thing. $50 for, you know, X or Y or Z.
right,
Maybe the subcommittee chair should have the discretion to not even have a subcommittee meeting and just bring the chair's recommendation to the open meeting. Just a thought.
I'd be
Because
fine
there's
with that.
nothing that binds us to have a subcommittee meeting for every you know, the moderator, what's his budget, $200? Do we really need to?
We cut his expenses.
You're not as lazy as I am.
I'm lazier than you are, I'm getting older by the minute.
At the discretion of the subcommittee.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so,
Okay,
so for the tiny ones, we could just make those simple.
all right. Okay, we'll think about that. I don't know whether we need, you know, some official cutoff, but I'm happy with the discretion of the chairs to decide whether they need meetings. And in that case, there wouldn't be subcommittee votes either.
That's
So-
right. There'd be no subcommittee report. The
Right.
chair would come to the main meeting, we open up the moderator's budget, here's what the chair says, and we just take it as a committee, done.
0% increase from the previous year, right?
Since you thoughtfully asked a question of what we might do differently, I think I was ruled out of order last year on this, but I'm going to say it again anyway.
Great.
One of the things I would suggest is that it would be really useful at each department to just have a list of the revolving accounts similar to what the school does. So for instance, with the school budget every month, we're now getting a list of here's the revolving accounts, start of year balance, income and expenses, you know, current balance. You know, I know at least when I was on Town Hall 2 last year, I was surprised how many revolving accounts were involved with that even. So my guess is
That's
there's,
the
you know,
problem, this is a big list.
my guess is there's a lot of them out there, and I'm not saying the committee has to go through and detail on every item, but at least know what the list is and what the balances are, and let's see if there's any surprises.
Maybe we could farm them all out by subcommittee, let the chair, when having a subcommittee meeting with the appropriate people, collect a little info on the status of the revolving accounts.
And just have each department head prepare a list of their,
Budget item, right?
no, I understand it's not part of the operating budget,
Not part of
but
the
Ways and Means is charged with reviewing all fiscal matters, and that certainly includes
The
revolving
chairman can
accounts.
send out an email. email, right, to all the department heads that this is gonna be required in
Need
the
to know the
subcommittee
list,
meeting?
though.
Right, I think.
I could, but yeah.
Yeah, you could.
We could even update the form if we wanted to, right?
Well,
Oh,
I
the
mean, if
forms.
I would say along with asking for the budget items, they should be able to provide a list of the revolving accounts, and if they can't easily provide that, I'd say that's a red flag right there.
Right, okay. I can check with our accountant and see what's available, because they keep track of all this stuff.
Great, thanks.
All right, and just one other small thing on the new business. Doug mentioned that he'd been at a building committee recently, and there was a little bit of sort of potential change of plan. Do you want to just give us the short version?
Sure, and we'll have more information. I think Monday we have another meeting. But the DPW rec maintenance building, if you remember, town meeting voted, it's being planned in 2 phases. The DPW and rec maintenance building at the Clark and Reed site.
Right.
And then the redoing the highway department, which is basically across the street. And so we funded phase 1, which included the estimated building cost for the Clark and Reed and the design of phase 1 and 2, so that we could make sure we didn't leave anything out. The architects are coming back, and I believe Monday, when they come with costs and estimates, that they'll be recommending that we consider funding the entire project for economy of scale, kind of. They feel like there's some savings to be done if we can bid the whole thing out as a longer project, but one big project done in 2 phases. It would still be done in 2 phases. We couldn't start the highway department until Clark and Reed was finished, but it would give us the opportunity to bid the whole thing as one big package.
But it would imply one bonding, the whole thing would have to be financed.
Not at once, no.
But not at once, because you could do.
Authorized, but not.
Authorized, but not funded until you.
Not-
If it's authorized by town meeting, then it certainly has to be slotted out of the bond schedule.
Yes.
Yes.
So how much money are we talking about?
What was phase 2, 20 million, 15?
Yeah, phase 2 might have been 15, something like that.
Yeah, so,
Sorry, I shouldn't
15 or
shrug over
16.
15
no,
million.
no,
That's a lot of
I
money.
think we need a little more feedback, what's coming up over the next 4 or 5 years from,
Well, this is kind of
Snagging
coming
company.
up anyway. It's just, I mean, we're not
delayed
talking.
that. What I'm concerned about is this, there's a whole stack up going on
Yeah.
here of things that have got to get built.
Yeah.
And between schools and the police station and a few other things, I just don't really know where we are anymore on the stack up.
Right. So we review the bond schedule. I'm sure capital budget is going to be in this up to their elbows.
Are they on this committee? Is any-
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
good.
they-
I would ask this question, is it more beneficial to the architect to do it this way, or is it more beneficial?
Of course.
Yeah.
But, yeah, well, I mean, you know, we can certainly listen to what they said.
Healthy skepticism is good, you know?
But I would hate to see us already talking about delaying phase 2, because then we've already delayed this project a long time, and you're talking about.
Well, I know we're in a hurry. All the delays have been the result of not having a plan.
Yeah.
Not financing. This delay could very well be financing, if at all.
Could be budget consideration, absolutely.
That's my point, and I just don't know. And there is a real stack up coming here.
Yep.
Do we know what percentage of money that potentially we would save by combining them into a single?
I think they haven't had those meetings yet.
No.
so it's a little early.
We'll see. It's a good
Monday
idea.
we'll get
Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm sorry. The other big change that they're recommending is the original plan that they brought to town meeting was to rehab the Clark and Reed, that big building at Clark and Reed. And once they've now started the design phase, the engineers have come back and said that you
Bulldozer.
have to, yeah.
Yeah, but that's another $1.5 million added to the project.
They're talking about it, at least as of now, the architect's saying it's about break even with the cost of reinforcing the floor, reinforcing the walls, new roof, reinforcing the roof.
Earthquake.
There's seismic issues with code that have to come up to new code standards. And
Glad you're on this committee.
if you tear it down, you're looking at a pre-engineered steel building. And so there's some savings in that versus trying to rehab and.
Can I suggest that you go to that meeting Monday?
You can suggest.
Just a suggestion.
I was kind of thinking Phil should go. He's got a lot of time.
My schedule's pretty tight.
Yeah, let me know, Doug. But anyway, obviously, this is a whole work in progress, and just an early update on potential changes, so.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? All right, thanks, everybody. Meeting adjourned.
I think I have to have lunch.